Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 811th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Michael Brenson and David Levi Strauss. And we're thrilled to welcome poet Paul Ebenkamp here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Art historian and curator Michael Brenson has been an art critic for the New York Times and has curated exhibitions at MoMA PS1 and the SculptureCenter. He has been a Getty Scholar, Guggenheim Fellow, Bogliasco Fellow, and Clark Fellow. He's taught at many universities, and he is the artistic director of the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. One of the most urgent and critical art writers working today, David Levi Strauss's work focuses on the intersection between image and text and the third space that is created through that interaction. His latest work is Co-Illusion, Dispatches from the End of Communication from MIT Press, exposing a new iconopolitics in which words and images lose their connection to reality. Thank you all so much for joining today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carolyn. So Michael's going to show some images to get us started.
Okay. Yeah, so welcome everybody, and Carolyn, thank you, and thanks to the Rail, and also to you, Levi, of course, for this conversation with me. I really look forward to it. And we thought that it would be important at the beginning to show some images of Smith's work, because some people who will be watching will have a pretty good idea already of what it is, but I'm sure that there are people who will not. So I'm just going to run through some images fairly quickly, a bunch of them, to make some points about them, introduce the work, and I think talk about them in such a way that we'll also be able to return to aspects of them, probably, I hope. So this is a photograph of Australia, which is probably Smith's best known work. He made it in 1951. It belongs to MoMA. It's certainly a work that embodies the idea of drawing in space. But I wanted to show this image to you also. It's Smith's photograph. It was probably the most reproduced image in his lifetime, and if you look at it in the photograph against the background in Bolton Landing in the Adirondacks where he lived, you kind of get a sense of the work, not just as a sculpture spinning, sort of moving in space, this hybrid image, but also this sculptural thing in relation to the landscape, where it becomes part of the sky and the hills, and the sky becomes part of the work. So in his photograph, which is the way in which many people met the work, it's as much dream and vision, or dream and vision are also part of the sculpture. And once you see the photograph, it becomes very hard to see the sculpture apart from the photograph. Okay, next, please. So I wanted to show you the photograph in relation to another photograph which was taken by MoMA, which gives you an idea perhaps of what the work would look like in the gallery. And seen in the gallery, it is a somewhat different work. It's got this sort of bounce and spring to it, and this creaturely life, but whatever it is in the landscape and the particular way in which the the sky, and the sky, the clouds, the trees perform in relation to the work. It becomes something else. So it's a work in the gallery and the museum with a particular life, and then the photograph gives it a life that's different from that, and somehow the work is, you know, is both of these things, both of these ideas together. The next, please. This is the same work, and it's to give you an idea of what Smith referred to as his end views, and to make the point that when you move around David Smith's work, that when you go from point of view to point of view, it's not just that the work changes. You're looking at you can feel that you're looking at an entirely different sculpture. So it's kind of a truism to say that a sculpture changes. It's different when you move around it, but the radicality of the changes in David Smith's work is something else, and part of the difference in the change that he brought to sculpture. Next. So this is Australia again, and these images are close to the ones on the cover of the book, and these photographs were also taken by Smith, and it gives you some sense both of the performativity of the sculpture and maybe the performativity of the artist himself. And they're funny images. I mean, particularly the image on the right, because on the one hand he looks like a big game hunter, and the sculpture looks like a trophy, but the more you look at it, you're not sure who is the trophy, and you know, who's the hunter, and the sculpture seems to be showing him as much as he seems to be showing the work. Next. So this is Jurassic Bird, which is 1945, and it's a work right after the war, and it's kind of got built into it the idea of evolution, of some kind of emergence from primal muck through the lungfish, which are those creatures that seem to be on a swing, and then the fossil on the top, and those forms in the middle look like you know, figures in a galley, as much as like you know, people or objects on an assembly line. So there's the idea of prehistory still happening, and prehistory still existing in the present. And James Miller is working on a doctoral thesis on the idea of prehistory in Smith's work. That's going to be a pretty wonderful contribution, I think. But I also wanted to give you an idea of how the work looked in the photographs and how it looks in different kinds of photographs. Both of these are Smith's photographs. Next. Yeah, so this is another version of Jurassic Bird. This is of course David Smith in the background of his cinder block house in Bolton Landing, and the work is placed on cinder blocks, and the work looks very different here again than it did in the other two photographs, and you know, it seems to have some kind of peculiar, even puzzling, but very active and very dramatic relationship to his life. Next. This is a pretty famous photograph, and of company of a visit to Bolton Landing in November 1952, and here Smith placed Jurassic Bird on a table, and some of you will undoubtedly recognize the people: Lee Krasner on the left, Jackson Pollock standing next to Smith, and then Clement Greenberg and Helen Frankenthaler to his right. And the woman to the right of Lee Krasner is Jean Fries, who was David Smith's second wife, and she's the mother of Rebecca and Candida Smith. Next. So this is Agricola 1, 1951, 1952. And it was the beginning of the Agricola series, and which was really the beginning of Smith's serial, let's call it Smith serial imagination after the war. The new catalog raisonné names decide on 17, that there were 17 Smith series, and they very often interrelated to one another. We worked on different series at the same time. The image on the left is the painted work, and it belongs to the Hirshhorn Museum. It is their photograph The image on the right, which is photographed by David Smith before it was painted, is also in the hills of Bolton Landing. And the Agricolas were sort of named after agricultural implements, which by and large he incorporated into the work. I think, as many of you know, Smith worked quite prolifically and continually with found objects. Next. This is a sculpture from 1951, from 1950. He made it, he finished it at the end of 1950. It's called The Letter. The photograph on the left was taken by the Munson Proctor Art Institute in Utica, New York, which owns the work. And the photograph on the right is Smith's photograph of the work in the landscape. And it's really a key work in many ways. You can, I mean, it's called The Letter. It has intimations of the letter. One scholar did see at the top left something that could be read as an address like "Dear Mother," but in fact, it's pretty incoherent, and you can't. Those letters don't form in any kind of coherent message at all. On the bottom right, you can make out David, and it does seem to be the signature David Smith, but attached to the letters David is what looks in fact like the back of a dinosaur. So the letter is, you know, his name itself is coming out of, or is always connected to, some notion of prehistory. And all the forms in the sculpture are letters of a kind, you know, O, N, I, Y, H, etc. But, you know, they're turned around, they're dancing forms, they also become images. And it was a really important idea to him to keep language tethered to the notion of an image, so that language was, first of all, image. He had a strong sense that once the language got disconnected from image, it was like a decline or a fall at that point into explanation and literalness. And the point in time where image and language were connected was a point where people saw the world where language is, which is much vision and dream and hallucination and imagination. And it was only this kind of disconnection of language from image where this more holistic or fuller way of perceiving reality was lost. And a lot, you know, Smith's whole interest in the alphabetic really begins with this work. It's an absolutely key work in his oeuvre, and it was made at a key and tumultuous moment in his life. Next, please. Yeah, this is just taken in the storeroom of the Munson Proctor, and I just wanted to give you some idea of what the letters look like up close. And all the O's, when you see them from the backside, if it is indeed the backside, open up into a series of other configurations or images. Next. Yeah, another of his great series. These are the tank totems. This is tank totem 3 and 4, and he photographed them on the dock of Bolton Landing, always in this kind of like untouched Edenic world where they seem to, you know, whenever you photograph them there, they seem to come out of and be connected to the beginnings of time. And the tank totems, these sort of amazing creaturely things. The third one there is just called 7/29/53. All three works come from 1953. But in terms of like his creaturely imagination, they're pretty amazing things, and they're called tank totems in part because all of them include a tank top within them. Next, please. Just to give you some idea of the color and the importance of color and paint in Smith's work. He began as a painter. He always painted. Many of his works are in fact painted. So this is Zig 4, one of his most famous works on the left in the landscape. These are his paintings too. And Zig 2, the Zigs are the series in which the use of color in the paint is the most complex and most pronounced and probably the most dramatic. And on both these works. There are multi-layers of paint. He could put, 20, 30, 40 layers of paint on them. Next. So his Cubi series, which is, surely his best known, he began the series in 1961, and he was still working on the series when he died in May 1965. And this is Cubi 1. And on the right, you see a famous photograph that Dan Budnick took of Smith completing the work in his studio, and then kind of a different sense of it, completed all the stainless steel parts in the Guggenheim Centennial Retrospective in 2006 with Australia in the background. Next. So just a series of the Cubis in his fields. This, all his series are kind of tribes and families and troops, all of them different, every part of all of them different. You see one of the Zig 3 sort of to the right in the background, and then a primo piano from there. But yeah, I've always been interested in Cubi 6, which is kind of the one toward the right, because it's like an automaton and in some sense like a walking figure. But I see a number of these works as being related to mythical aspects of sculpture and what sculpture has been through time. And you pick up not just the difference of the work and the vitality of the work, but also the real peculiarity of these things as sort of amazing individual creatures. Next. So it's Cubi 17, and this was photographed from the patio, which is part of his working studio at the entrance to his property in Bolton Landing, and one of the Cubis that most directly refers to the idea of the still life and cubism, etc. Next. I wanted to give you some idea of the Voltri series, because this was the great moment in Smith's life. He was invited to spend time in Italy and work in a factory of Italcedar, which was the Italian equivalent of US Steel, and wound up working in an abandoned factory in Voltri, which is about 12 kilometers outside of Genoa. He had all the equipment he wanted. He had men to work with him. And basically for a month, he was treated like a king, able to do exactly what he wanted to do. And in that month, he made 27 sculptures, and only 1 or 2 were supposed to be made for the exhibition of sculptures in the city in Spoleto. But obviously he made many more. And once the work stream started in him, it just kept going. So these are 2. This is Voltri 13 on the left, which the curator of sculpture in the city, Giovanni Carandente, installed in the city of Spoleto. And that's Voltri 1 on the right, which is also in the streets of Spoleto. Next. So Carandente, when he was presented with all these works, and he couldn't include them, and there were too many of them to include in the sculpture exhibition that he had planned. There were about 100 sculptures that he had planned in Spoleto. He had the amazing idea of giving Smith his own space, and that space was the old Roman first century amphitheater in Spoleto. So in this amphitheater, 22 of the sculptures of Smith's sculptures were installed, and you get a sense of how amazing it would have been to have seen them there, and for him to have had them installed there, and for someone to have treated them and treated him as well as he was treated there. this was, Candida Smith has mentioned that this was really the beginning of beginning another stage of the fields in Bolton Landing. That this, from when he got back, then he put more and more works in the field, and the whole idea of sculpture in the landscape really took off as something in itself. Next. Yeah, another shot of the Roman amphitheater. As I said, it was his, the great moment in his life, and these really are astonishing works. There is a kind of energy and playfulness and imaginativeness to this series that you really need to be around to see. And they are, as always with Smith, every work in a series is different, every part is different. And it has a kind of affectionate, effective energy that's really hard to overestimate. Next, please. Another one of the Voltries. This is Voltry 4, and then you see Smith on a wagon with the Voltries. And I look at this photograph and I think a little bit of that earlier photograph of him underneath Australia, and the particular ways in which he relates to the sculpture, but maybe more significantly, the sculpture seemed to be relating to him and him alone. Next. Yeah, just to give you some sense of how Smith worked. I mean, he didn't work, from the floor always throughout his career, but he did very much work this way during his last years, to lay out the objects on the floor and then plan them, and then sort of, weld them, tack weld them, build them up, and then weld them from there. The image on the left is him in the studio, and in his studio in Bolton Landing, and then the image of the right is one of the great photographs that Ugo Mullis took of Smith working in Voltry, where he had these factories, these huge factories to himself, and he laid out the tables and laid out the objects on the tables and worked from there. Next. Also Voltry, where you get a sense of the quantity of objects that were made available to him, and this idea, of drawing the outline of the thing out on the floor. This is something he did in Voltry. He also did it in Bolton Landing. Next. Yeah, these amazing photographs of him sort of dwarfed in these abandoned factories and in Voltry, and this looks like a kind of a Romanesque church to me, sort of evacuated and emptied out. And he set up the table and worked, and in this like amazing scale, and was completely comfortable working in these places sort of by himself, where the workmen came in and helped him. Next. And yeah, the largest of the abandoned factories. I mean, the scale of the thing is hard to imagine, and it also gives you a sense of the scale of Italcedar, the steel company, and the kind of ambition that these steel companies had at that point. This is 1962, after the war in Italy, and I'm sure elsewhere too. This belief in the scale of what they were doing, that steel could really change the world, and steel was David Smith's material. Next. Yeah, this is Candida on the left and Rebecca on the right, and this is Primo Piano 1 in 1962, sort of made after the trip to Italy, and his daughters were a huge part of his life and a huge part of his work, and he named a number of works after them, and certainly took photographs of them in relation to the work. Next. And just a couple of other colored images. This is Becti Today on the left, which was made in 1963. Rebecca was born in April and Candida on April 12th, and they visited him during the summer in Washington. And while they were there, usually in April, Smith made a birthday party in which both their birthdays was celebrated. Therefore, you get the title Dita Day, and it's an kind of extraordinarily playful and buoyant work. And you've got the blue on the one side, and you've got the yellow on the other side. The colors of sky and sun, and that really bounce in that particular landscape. The 1962, 1963, another series, which are the Circle series. He made 5, and this is actually 3 of them, with seen through the one lens, seen through another, seen through another. The opening circles in the sculpture, which can seem like a lens coming in and out of focus. And this was taken at the National Gallery in Washington, where they still are, and they still are on display. Next. Circles 1, 2, 3, and 5 in the field. This begins to give you some sense of the sculpture, in the landscape. This is the north field. You see Zig 4 in close to the circles in the landscape, and he liked to photograph sculpture in the snow. Next. This is a strange photograph that was taken by Alexander Lieberman a week before Smith died, because the sculptures look, you see the circles and also untitled Candida behind them, a stainless steel work, but the sculptures look gigantic here, and they're not. So he bought a red Honda trail bike, and that he became quite infatuated with. And you see an image of him actually driving around, of course, sort of driving around amid the sculptures, around the sculptures. Next. Famous photo by Dan Budnick, taken in 1963. It appeared in Life magazine, where he said it was the only photograph that he asked David Smith to pose for. But you see him sitting, on the bench overlooking the sculptures in the South Field, a sort of, an enormous human comedy of things that of sculptural things that he created, sort of performing and dancing for him, and the particular vitality they had on the hillside within the landscape. Next. Yeah, and a final image. So Smith died in May of 1965, and Budnick came in maybe a year or 2 later, and he photographed the fields. This is the north field. You see the south field on top from above, and some of the sculptures at this point had been removed, but you see the way he arranged them in the north field. They look fairly regular here, and they were, but there were always breaks in the regularity. There were about 80 of them in all in the fields when he died. And then, in the way he arranged them in the south field on top was quite different, more arbitrary, it seemed, but just as the amazement of his production, and the kind, the fields as an idea of themselves, as some kind of dream of sculpture as their own world, in which the individual sculptures relate to one another and to the landscape, and keep performing their own kind of language, like their new kind of language, sort of forming and reforming. It's really astonishing idea. I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the fields, and it's the fields of David Smith. It's an exhibition that Storm King did around 98 to 2000, but it remains for me an amazing idea and a fundamental theme that runs through the book. So that's it, I think.
Great. So much to talk about, so little time. But I want to try to talk about the book as a book. So your biography is a magnificent work, full of fascinating detail and a chorus of voices. And it's also a compelling read. I mean, I encourage everyone to read it. It's a biography of David Smith, yes, but it's also a history of art and artists, primarily in New York City. And it's a history of art collecting and a political history. And it's also a book about power in the art world, and how that changed the shifts in power over the first half of the 20th century. Michael, you and I have done this once before, talked about the book in public at the studio school, and there we focused mainly on the questions about the relation between an artist's life and an artist's work, which is especially potent when you're talking about David Smith. But in this one, in the time that we have, I'd like to try to focus on two things: the actual writing of the book and the relevance of David Smith's art and thinking about art and his belief in art for the present. So I've noticed that a lot of reviews of biographies tend to treat the biography as a kind of a transparent medium. I mean, they've just reporting on the facts of a life and putting them in order. I know that that's not the way your book happened, and I know that there's a lot more of you in the book than people might think. So I want you to talk about how the book began and how it changed. I should note again that you've been working on the book for the entire time that I've known you, over 20 years. How do you think the book was affected by that, having been worked on for so long? How long did it take you to work out the overall structure of the book, the chapters, etc.? There are many short chapters, which is one of the features of the book that makes it so compelling. And also talk about your engagement with Smith's work, when that started, and so how did the book come about?
So I think the book probably started in, or really sort of germinated in 1990. I mean, I had known about David Smith's work for 25 years prior to that. I think it was 67 or 68, like that I first became aware of it, which was pretty soon after he died. And having done a doctoral thesis on Giacometti, Smith and Giacometti were linked. And so Smith was kind of always around, and I knew the work and was always interested in the work. So in 1990, I wrote a review for the New York Times. I wrote an arts and leisure piece on an exhibition at Knoedler. I think it was called To and From the Nude. I might be getting it mixed up, but anyway, I saw the show, was interested in the show, just went back and wrote a review of it, and just was tremendously interested in the work. And after the review appeared, I got letters from Candida Smith and Peter Stevens, who would end up running the Smith estate for a while. He was married to Rebecca, and Dorothy Daner, who was Smith's first wife and was married to him for 25 years. And they were appreciative. And, people wrote letters then. So the fact that they're taking the time to write me and say something about what they felt about a certain kind of connection with the artist, it sunk in. I didn't think about it. You put the letters aside. But I realized in retrospect that it made a difference. And then in 1996, I believe, Carmen Jimenez, who was the curator at the Guggenheim, who would curate the Smith retrospective, asked me to write an essay on Smith for a Smith exhibition at the Reina Sofia. It was a strange, essay to write, because I remember having 10 days and I wrote 7,000 words. I mean, God knows what it would be like to read that thing now, but it was just the continuation of a real interest, and I was glad to take on the project and did the best I could with it. And I started to really read about the work. And then in 1996, Knoedler asked me to write for another Smith show, and I called the essay David Smith's Embrace. And it was a sense of the totality of the work, and it was a sense of like all that he wanted, which was everything. And it was my first visit to Bolton Landing. And after that show, or at the opening of that show, I met Jean Fries, who was Smith's second wife. And Jean was as appreciative of the essay as, you know, Dana and Dita and Peter had been earlier. So, you know, something was really building here. And I was very much involved with contemporary art, but I had this long-standing interest in modernist sculpture, and was very committed to it. And I got increasingly interested in the notion of biography, which seemed to me that if you're interested in writing about art from multiple points of view, it seemed to me like the ultimate art form. So the interest in biography, the interest in modernist sculpture, the interest in David Smith, and the fact that people who knew David Smith, who were part of his family, were interested in my doing something. It just came together. So
were there models that you had for what a biography could be?
I had more models of what I didn't want a biography to be. I could give you, example. I had been around James Lord when he was doing his biography of Giacometti. And James was a friend, but it's a very moralistic book, and he's very pissy sometimes and superior in relation to people he was writing about. It's quite disgusting what he did, the attitude that he took to Simone de Beauvoir in that book. I did not want to write a moralistic book, and that even more clearly over time, we live in a moment that's drowning in moral indignation, and I didn't want to write a book that would be part of that. So I didn't want to take that attitude toward people in the book. I didn't want to be moralistic. And then, I should add to that, the first biography that I read when I took on the project was James Breslin's biography of Mark Rothko. It's in many ways a really admirable book. It's got a lot of information. It's a very responsible book, but I came away from that book feeling that Rothko was pitiful, and it had turned into a kind of pathography. And the reason it had become that was because Breslin couldn't do justice to the work. Like if the work of a great artist is allowed to breathe within the book, then whatever story you're telling about the life is connected to the work, but it never overtakes the work, and the work can always exist and breathe on its own. So those were red flags for me. And so I felt very strongly that in this book, the work had to live. Maybe I should just start and that there really was no model for a kind of biography that I wanted to write. There have been abstract expressionist biographies. There's a kind of genre. There are biographies of Pollock. Mark Stevenson, Annalyn Swan wrote a very good book on de Kooning, and the particular ways in which they dealt with the background material, that was very interesting to me. But in terms of how to deal with the work and how to deal with the work in relation to the life, there were no models. And that's, just to keep talking, I read a biography of Keats by Eileen Ward. I read the famous Holmes biography of Coleridge. And the Coleridge biography is a tour de force in terms of narrative storytelling. But when I got to the point where I wanted to know about Kubla Khan, and I wanted to know about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, or in the Ward book with Keats, where I really wanted some kind of entry into the poems. It wasn't there. So there was, it was this problem of challenge of how to write a biography, but also write about it in such a way that that the work would be there and to some degree would be allowed to speak on its own, and where there would be a point of entry for people who just wanted to know about the work, maybe not so much about the life. So this was an essential challenge for me from the very beginning.
You talk about how, so you're constantly going back to the work, and you were trained as an art historian. It was kind of an opportunity to do art history in a different way. It's another, I've also noticed in the reaction to the responses to the book that people, once the material is out there, they treat it like has always been known. I mean, there's common knowledge or something. So it's not, there's not a recognition of what art historically was, the ground that's broken there. But I wanted to ask you about, so you're going back to the work over and over again. Over that much time, your view of the work changed, I'm sure. Can you characterize that, how it changed with?
Yeah, it's a good question and so fundamental, because David Smith is an artist whose work is always changing. I mean, that's kind of the miracle of someone who could make sculpture that on some level comes out of the tradition of statuary, and yet is forever fluid, forever beginning and forever changing. That's sort of, built into the nature of abstraction, as he understood it. And he said, he made very many eloquent statements about, you're not the same from one moment to the next. The way you see things from one moment to the next is always going to be different. And one sort of amazing statement about who you are is never who you are, but always an expectancy. So the idea of identity that he had was both something that was very rooted in a particular history and something that was constantly changing. So to answer your question, the work is never the same. And it was a constant for me over 20 years to look at the work, because there were many chances to look at it. And every time you see the work, you see it differently. That the forms themselves seem to be always mutating. I mean, sort of, you think of the Australia too, where, from the beginning, where you're never quite sure what it is because it's multiple forms. And when you move around it, it's changing. So that fact of a variable body of work, where the work itself was never the same from moment to moment, invariably got into the writing itself. And also suggest to you, I think, that if I had written a book where I had not paid that much attention to the work and just the life, it would have been a completely different kind of work. So the sculpture was always informing my sense of the mutability, the always beginningness, this kind of miraculous sense of everything being different, even in a particular moment, that's built into the nature of the work. And that has to become part of the writing as well. It's like an interesting, question how it does that. And just to respond a little bit to the first part of your question, I do feel that there's a lot of art history in the book, and I do take on problems that exist in the literature, and I do think that I extend them or make it possible to look at them in different ways, if not actually resolve them. And I do hope at a certain point, that people who write about the book will take that on or comment on it. I mean, I feel, even with Dorothy Daner, who's a huge part of the book. I mean, she's Smith's first wife. She's a remarkable, figure. I love her. And, she was really, really important. Well, she just has never had that big a role in Smith's work. People know they were married. They know she was important. Paula Wyszkowski has done sort of pioneering research on their relationship. But to actually write a book in which she is so present and so fully present, you can read it and you can take for granted that this was always there. But no, it wasn't always there. So something in me definitely would like people who were familiar with Smith and the Smith literature to, kind of begin to sort through what happens in this book that did not happen in previous books, or take on problems that I spent a lot of time thinking about that get resolved here that weren't resolved before.
Just as the work was constantly changing and mutable, the life was changing too, as you examined it from all sides and were talking to so many people, interviewing so many people. What were the hardest parts of the book and the biggest obstacles? Did this have to do with absorbing Smith's behavior, which was sometimes atrocious, and in the writing and telling the story? Was that the hardest part? Or
well, what you say about interviewing the people is yeah, it's so interesting. People who do biographies do a lot of interviews. Assuming that they're writing about like a 20th century artist or someone contemporary. And there's no question that the interviews I did, and I did a lot of them, I think maybe 100 formal interviews and maybe 200 in all. So you talk to people and it's always changing that way because people obviously see David Smith differently. They fill in aspects of the life. But they also, it's like, there's so many points of view to the work. This multiple points of view, which he got out of Cubism to some degree, and then this kind of choreography of perspectives that's built in through the voices, and the voices keep changing. They get into my head, and they're continually animating the material that you're researching and you're writing about, and animating the work as well. So that's part of the way in which something like this is an organism. And it's got its own rhythm and it's got its own demands, and it's moving and evolving over time in a way that you can only go with. It's very hard just to say, stop, basta, this is it. Although at a certain point you have to do that and start writing. In terms of your question about obstacles, I could say that there were, there are challenges for me from the beginning, which wouldn't be there with other people, perhaps. Like, I could say with Dorothy Dana, I did a lot of research on her life, and a lot of what I know comes through her words. And so it was very hard for me at a certain point to take those words and make them my words. Like I felt if I'm hearing the story, if I'm getting it through other people's voices, then I have to tell that story through other people's voices. But and there's a lot of that in the book, but it's also a problem because it's not readable necessarily to do it that way. And you get too much. So I had my first chapter on Dorothy Dana was like 7,500 words, and it's just not workable. This is not her biography. It's David Smith's biography. So, how do I cut it down? And if I have everything in her language, how do I narrate, what I need to say about her life leading up to the point where they met. And I think this is like a personal issue for me that other people wouldn't run into. So then finally, it's just, at a certain point I could do it. I could take 7,500 words and I turned it in 1,800 words. And that became like the beginning of the chapter where they met. So those are, that's a particular issue. And then I spent a long time writing the chapter on the Medals for Dishonor, which are the works he did between 1936 and 1940. The most overtly political series he did, which is sort of breathtaking. It's sort of anti-war, anti-capitalist venom. But it's also, those are deeply symbolic works. There's an excess in them. I knew how to approach that as a art historian, as a critic, which is to kind of, to go through them one by one, to try to figure out their iconography, to try to figure out the iconography in relation to the form. But this is a biography. And how do you do that? And how do you write work like that in a biography? So I gave a lecture on the metals. It was like 6,000 words on the metals. The book is a 3,000 word chapter. So this is a problem. It's a problem. It's a real problem of writing, and it's a way where being an art historian is both a benefit and and a detriment, because in a biography you can talk about work and you have to, but you also can't say too much. I mean, you have to know when you're writing to the point where you're going to lose the readers, and it just becomes another kind of writing and another kind of book. And this is all intuitive, and I don't know, whether I did it right, but this is a question to negotiate all the way through.
Well,
and then
you ended up with a structure that, as I say, is really compelling to read. These short chapters, and even though it's 800 pages, it was originally twice that long and could have been 3 times that long. So you had to leave a lot out to get there, and that's so that you get this compression. But I wanted to, you make it clear in the book that how much, and it comes out, how much David Smith believed in art, the power of art. And he wasn't the only one of his generation, but and you say that never waned in his entire life. I mean, you said, I think he lost his belief in his own life, but never his belief in art. And it seems like that kind of belief is in short supply now. So how does that translate? How do you think that translates today? What relevance does it have today? I think in the book, you quote FDR saying the conditions for democracy and for art are one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for us now?
Okay, I mean, maybe I think this question of belief, it's so interesting, because I ask myself, like, where did it come from? I mean, he grew up in the small towns of the Midwest. I mean, he grew up in Decatur, Indiana, and then in Paulding, Ohio, and he wasn't exposed to art there, but he had some kind of idea at the beginning of what art could be and what it could mean to be an artist, and that being an artist could be something completely different from the provincial life, the narrowness that he had grown up with, that he had found quite stifling, to the point where he ran away from the Midwest to New York at the age of 20. So where did this idea come from? That's it's an interesting question. It's a scholarly question. And then when he got to New York, he picked it up immediately. He and Dana both shared it, this tremendous sort of idealism. I think they came into modernism at a point where all the energy of that burgeoning moment and possibility, and of reinvention and reimagining, was built into the making and the experiencing of it. So being around it, seeing European modernism when it came to New York in the late 20s and early 30s, seeing it must have had this like extraordinary excitement to it. And he was someone who absorbed Cubism, Surrealism, Distille, constructivism, all it like hit him all at once. And all of, all of this, they were about seeing the world differently and about changing the world. And it had this kind of magical, magnetic energy and possibility to it. And given where they had come from, given the First World War, that they had lived through, given their sense of the injustice, the history of the injustice in this country, which went very deep in both Smith and Dana. When they got hit by it, it was really profound, and it stayed with Smith all his life. I mean, there was this kind of immense idealism and kind of absolute belief in what art could be, and what the experience of art could do to people who came in contact with it. And for him, it was very strongly connected with sculpture, but not just sculpture. And I mean, I think it's an amazing story, that story of the belief, and it never wavered. As you said, it was there, and it was there right to the end, and you feel it in the work right to the end, like the particular kind of energy and invention and uncompromisingness of the work, because he didn't repeat itself. So, in sense of the question you're asking, Levi, about the relation to the present moment, I don't know how to answer it exactly. I think, there's a lot of criticism of modernism, and yet there's still kind of an inevitable attraction to it and what it represented, and the kind of latent energies and latent ideas that remain buried in it. And they become a form of research for some contemporary artists' work. So there's a wanting, I can see it, of that kind of energy and potentiality and possibility, even while rejecting aspects of modernism that don't seem to be appropriate or possible anymore in the moment. But so I don't know how to answer your question, except to remark that it was absolute. It was not completely connected to the commercial world. The fact that maybe artists you could live much more cheaply then, that you could get by, and that there was also a community of artists that sustained themselves like a kind of family, even though it was a family that fought all the time. I mean,
Dysfunctional family.
All this seems part of it, and being part of the beginning of the modern and the Whitney and the Guggenheim. All these things were happening that communicated an energy and a desire that art needed to be brought into the culture, had to be brought into the culture. And when it did, that the world could change with it, and that people would get behind it. The government, big money, corporations or whatever, but that art would be leading the way. I don't know, I'd be interested in how you would answer that question in terms of relation to now.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, Smith never concealed his contempt for most of the managers of the art world, museum people, gallerists, and curators. And whenever he could, he went around them to get to collectors and viewers, if he could. And I was thinking about, throughout your own life as a writer on art, you've often defended artists against the institutions of art, and also against society's demands and strictures and prejudices about artists. And I think that Smith is kind of a limit case for this. On the one hand, even though he railed against the institutions, he was supported by them. And he also hated a lot of things about American society, but he was supported by it as well, pretty extensively, and connected and integrated into society. So I'm not sure how to account for that. and I also wanted to ask you about the future of relation to Smith's work. Kirk Varnado planned this monumental retrospective of David Smith at MoMA, and then Varnado died in 2003 at a young age. And you say when he died, hopes for an encyclopedic Smith show died with him. Do you think it'll ever happen, or do you think it'll happen soon?
Well, let me go back to the first part of, what you said. Smith always put whatever money he had into art, and by and large, people, he had a kind of relationship with curators and dealers where they did what he wanted them to do. I don't mean that like that sounds sort of imposing, but there was really some kind of fundamental collision between him and the dealers and the curators, and he always he put everything he had back into the work. He wasn't so much protecting a way of life because he wanted to live on the edge, and he always lived on the edge. So he kept himself in a state of precariousness. He did make money from time to time, and it just went back into the work. And then he had collectors who were important to him, and the collectors, like, he felt in the passion of collectors something that was close to his own passion. Because collectors, they put their money where their mouths were, right? And Lois Orswell, who was a great collector, was, passionately devoted to the work. And so he had these people who made it possible for him to keep going, whose support, was essential to him, and who bought his work and gave him confidence that the work would be kept together and shown in a way that he wanted it to be, so that he didn't. So that he didn't compromise. I mean, I think, I saw, maybe other people too. So I saw the David Hammons film a couple of weeks ago, because there's an example of someone who's lived his own life in the art world, and he's called his own shots, and he's never done anything other than what he's felt he's needed to do. And if he's had to piss people off, he's done it. And collectors and collectors, sort of dealers, curators have stayed with him. And there's also something fundamentally uncompromising and magical about the work. And in some way, it's to make a link from David Hammons to David Smith. I don't know if people might be shocked or even offended by that, but it was interesting for me to think about that. But then Hammons is, he's a special kind of a talent, but perhaps there are ways of operating out there in which people with enormous belief in what art can be and what it needs to be can function the way they need to be in the culture, and they pay a price for it. It's an enormous toll. It always is. Smith, it took a huge toll on Smith, but he did it. And in relation to your question about, I don't know if Kirk was, actually planning. He had an idea. I mean, I know this through, only through Peter Stevens. He had an idea of a David Smith show that would fill the Museum of Modern Art, the way the Picasso and Matisse shows had filled MoMA. So it would not just be his sculpture. It would be his drawings, I'm sure, now his photographs, but he believed that Smith was as great an artist as Picasso and Matisse were, but he was a sculptor, and people weren't going to see that. And he was going to give him the same kind of treatment that he had given Picasso and Matisse. And by so doing, and also write a history of David Smith, but write a history of sculpture and deal with the work in its enormous sprawl, because it's a very, very difficult body of work to deal with. There's a lot of it. There are these series that run sort of all over the place. There are the paintings and the sculpture, and it would be absolutely amazing to see that work together. Do I think, in fact, that the dream of that show died with Kirk? I'm not sure. I have an instinct that someone somewhere along the line will get an idea of doing a show like that, but God knows when it will be. It probably won't be during my lifetime.
Let's hope so. Let's hope they're listening. Carolyn, where are we on time?
Yeah, we're doing great. If you want to ask another question, feel free, or we have a couple from the audience as well.
I have so many questions. Maybe.
Please feel free to ask another, Levi, please.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Clement Greenberg first saw Smith's work in 1943. So he was 33 and had just started writing for The Nation. And in that first review, he said, Smith is 36. If he's able to maintain the level set in the work he's already done, he has a chance of becoming one of the greatest of all American artists. And in 1947, Greenberg went all in with Smith, calling him the greatest sculptor this country has produced and deserving to stand next to Brancusi, Lipschitz, Giacometti, Gonzalez, not to mention Lawrence and Moore. At one point in the book, you say that Greenberg supported and understood Smith's work until the later work, and you definitely take him to task for the things he did as an executor. But the work was always, but you say that the work was always un-Greenbergian. And I wanted to ask you about what, can you talk more about that? How was the work un-Greenbergian?
Well, I think Greenberg, obviously got something profound, and he got it immediately in a way that's quite amazing. And he got it through the form and probably the connection to Cubism, and the abstraction. But I think, this is an interesting question, something, Chris Lyon and I have, talked about the impact of the critical literature, the impact on David Smith of the critical literature from Clement Greenberg and Rosalind Krauss, and the way in which it still affects the moment. Smith was fundamentally an impure artist. The work is sort of, fundamentally contaminated on certain level. And I'm just talking about the imagery, but I'm talking about the materials. I'm talking about using paint in relation to sculpture. I'm talking about the particular way in which he combined different kinds of metals. I'm talking about the nudes that he made in the early 60s at the same time that he was making the abstraction, because identity was so multiple for him, and he had to work in multiple directions and do different kinds of things. So and that's that aspect of it. I don't think Greenberg had any sense of or could ever really fully grasp the kind of the excess, the fluidity, the ways of rubbing things together that didn't fit together in the work, all those things that give it a particular kind of energy. And I think what I'm just going back to that initial image of Australia, right? The connection with art from other cultures, the connection to dreams and visions. Those are his words. The particular importance of the work in relation to landscape, so that it wasn't something where the ultimate home for the work was in a gallery or a museum. The shamanic aspect of Australia and other work, the way at which it can, seem to be there to actually perform on people. So it's not just something to look at. It's something that can act on people. I'm talking about stuff now that is nowhere to be found in the Greenbergian approach to Smith, and really is nowhere to be found in Rosalind Krauss, who was also a great writer. on Smith. I mean, she got certain things in Smith. So I feel like these aspects of Smith, which could have some kind of real meaning and interest in the moment, were kind of closed off by them. And it's partly what I mean by feeling that in order for Smith to really move on and move in the present and be what he can be in the present, we have to acknowledge the importance of those people who came before those critics, but also acknowledge the limitations of their influence. And at this point, I think really we need to find a way to go beyond them.
Yeah, and I think that those un-Greenbergian parts are where the future is in terms of reception of Smith's work. Carolyn, have you got questions?
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. Thank you both so much for this conversation, really. So let's see, our first question is from GE, and Chloe's going to ask a question on his behalf.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Let me pull up GE's question for you both. GE's question is, in spending countless times with Smith's Bolton series through Albany's Empire Plaza and in visits to Bolton Landing, I was always struck by the sense that the work was a deeply anthropological expression. Is there anything to this? Thank you.
I wonder if he could define, is this for Michael? Define what he means by anthropological there. I mean, I'm sure he's right. I just like something more particular to respond to in the question.
GE, I'll give you a chance to respond in the chat.
It just seems as though he encompasses all of our human history, all the way forward from the most primordial, from a Mesopotamian times to our present, to his present, and well beyond, and also obviously the great expanse of geological time and all of of everything that ever existed. So in that sense,
I think it's fantastic, what you say, and I think about the explicit geological interest in the work, like the interest in strata, in geological strata, and the fact, and that's a little bit that generation, where he went back to prehistory, and was interested in, that was really the entire history of art. And from the beginnings until the present, I mean, that kind of curiosity, that almost systematic curiosity about everything that came before and feeling part of everything that came before, that seems to me, part of that moment. And I don't know, I mean, I know plenty of artists with great curiosity, but he kind of wanted everything, that idea of David Smith's embrace that I had. And I think of a famous quote by de Kooning where he talked about the history of art as being a train. That I don't remember all the people. I think Mondrian was on it, and Assyria was on it, and going back to prehistory, and they were all on that train, and they were all part of that same family. And they had a sense that that the kind of art that existed in prehistory, that the art that existed at the beginnings of time could never be surpassed. So to talk about progress of art, it didn't make sense. I mean, if art was necessary to human progress, it did not itself progress. So that this really voracious hunger for the history of art and for archaeological time and geological time, and wanting all of it, and wanting all of it to be part of the work, and feeling that the work, in order to be what it had to be, had to hold all of that within it. I think you're absolutely right.
Pollock and Smith were very competitive with each other, and Pollock sometimes dismissed Smith's work by saying that he was a folk artist. It was folk sculpture. And I don't think that's a dig, actually.
Uh, I don't know if, I mean, I know Pollock was competitive with Smith. The idea of competition with Smith is an interesting one. I don't know quite how to answer it. But I know, you know, Smith had a sense of who the important people were, and Pollock was one of them. And there's no question of wanting to do something in sculpture that was the equivalent, every bit as good as what sculpture had, what Pollock had done in painting. Yep.
And Pollock knew that he couldn't compete in sculpture with.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, GE. Let's see. There's just another question that just came in. From Ellen. Let's see, you should.
I'll ask it.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. We have this great question from Ellen in the audience. Michael, can you expound on your comment about art that acts on people rather than just being looked at?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And interesting to think about David Smith that way, because it's kind of, you know, Greenberg is so identified with opticality, and Smith was someone for whom it was essential for art to be seen and not touched, that visual perspective was all important. But, you know, I think I have to talk about energy. And the kind of energy that is set off by the materials and by the imagery itself, like this constantly changing image world, and what happens through the attachment of one form to another form, and then the relationship to the environment, so that if in fact you're moving around these sculptures and you're taking them in relation to what they are and in relation to the environment itself, that there's some kind of process that's set in motion that can only be realized by a physical participation in looking and in the space that's activated by the work. So it's not passive. That the relationship to the work has its agency, and the elements of the work have its agency, and then in relation to the ways in which the viewer participates in the work, there's this energy and agency set a process in motion, and in relation to that process of experience, something can happen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that question. And thank you, Michael, for your answer. And our final question today will be from our very own Fong. Lee, you should be able to unmute, Fong.
Thank you so much, Michael and David, for this very thoughtful and I would say expansive conversation. I was thinking the whole time just now in maybe around 2005, when I had this lengthy phone conversation that lasted like an hour and a half, and the portable phone died with the great our late friend Leo Steinberg, and he and I was talking about Barbara Rowe's incredible essay that was published in Art Magazine, of how she make claim in her own reading that Pollock was the sole successor of Mondrian, whereas Mondrian had eliminated the idea of containment of the painting. In other words, the invention of horizontal and vertical structure forced the elimination of the frame. It's true that Mondrian was very conscious of that, therefore often would edit a piece of wood and paint it white to prevent people to put frame around it. And in Alan Capro, Legacy of Jackson Pollock, that essay, when he wrote it, he makes similar claim as he being the founder of Happening was in fact go beyond what Pollock had already done, broke the convention of the easel, put on the floor, performing, and so on and so forth, which bring to mind my talk with Leo about how he at one point said that what is so remarkable about David Smith is that he seemed to embody both Pollock legacy and then the European legacy that he felt similarly have already embodied in de Koonin's work. It's so interesting to me. I never understood what that meant. So I want to bring this up, partly because, you know, when you think about when Rosalind did her thesis, which revised in Terminal Iron, which I read with pleasure, great pleasure. That must have been in 75, 76. I still have
the book is 71, yeah.
Right, the expanded version is, you're right, 71, sorry. 79, of course, the legendary expanded field sculpture. So thinking about that, bring back to the very interesting fact, when she was Harvard, that's when she met Michael Free. And through Michael Free, that's how she met Clement Greenberg in the following year. She already started writing for Art Magazine, Art International, when she was in graduate school. We had this long talk once also with Rosalind herself. But my question is this: in 72, it's not many people had read this at all until later, after Maya Shapiro died in 93. His widow, Dr. Milgram, put out a huge volume which include Shapiro's amazing essay on semiotic, which is the first of his studies field, called On Some Problem in the Semiotics of Visual Art, Field and Vehicle and Image Sign. 1972, quite remarkable, long time ago. So the question, I wonder whether what we seem to acknowledge and take it for granted, that it's only through modern art that modernism, that we gain a greater appreciation of prehistoric art. And I think that ties into David's question about Pollock claiming David Smith as a folk artist. I don't think he meant as a as a detriment here, David. I think a lot of those people was very conscious of the American early tradition of art because they were self-taught. I mean, that's something we are coming to terms with today. But it's true when you take Edward Hicks, for example, the book I just read recently, a lot of early Americans were not taught, not until, you know, someone like John Singleton Copley gets sent to England to study, but a lot of them were not. I think Pollock will barely get a few lessons from Thomas Hart Benton at Art Student Lee. So I don't know whether that holds true. What do you think about that, Michael? The idea of semiotic, but also not just scholarly, it's also the direct link to early art before the Renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I'm not sure how to answer the semiotics question. I do think definitely that what Pollock was saying about Smith calling it, he and Krasner calling it folk art, I think it's definitely pejorative.
Okay.
You know, Greenberg would explain that later on. I mean, for people who don't know it, like the sculpture of the 40s, there are all sorts of these little things attached to the sculpture, like little images and symbols and, you know, gizmos or whatever. And that's what Greenberg said that was putting them off, and like a kind of deflection of attention, like too fine detail or whatever. So it was definitely sort of pissy in a way that, you know, didn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, and I mean, I'm interested in a lot of what you say. I think this kind of connection to the fullness of the past came through modernism and came through that generation, and thinking about like that deeper past. I also think about the ceremonial aspect of Smith's work, and to think about Australia, you know, the kind of ritual aspect of it, the particular way it performs, the ceremonial, you know, playfulness and potency that it had. That sort of goes way back, and that moves into the surrounding space. So if we're talking about not recognizing that, then we're also not recognizing the way in which Smith's work has actually extended, you know, beyond 1980, where I think Krauss kind of cut it off by a lack of interest in him, into the present moment. So that aspect of the work really has to be acknowledged now and dealt with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael, because I remember once when Hermann Nitsch came to visit with Jonas Makers, we talked about how Austrian actionist people, including Altamul and others in Austria, who were so excited reading in corporal and performing art as he understood, well understood, that it's an extension from Pollock's painting, happenings and earth art, and so the performing or ritualistic act is come out from Pollock. And it's so interesting going back to Shapiro's famous, I think important semiotic paper. I just want to explain quickly about feel or vehicle. What feel meaning that prior to the invention of the canvas, the definitive format, whether square, rectangle, portable object, it was on the natural surface of the cave wall. There's no boundary. So in fact, you can argue that sculpture might even come before painting in some aspects if someone were touching the surface of the cave wall and there protrusive part of spatial protrusion that might fit or describe the body of the bison. So therefore, sculpture might have been discovered before pigment would be applied onto it. So there's no awareness of the rectangle. That's only later invention of man, really. That's only came about in Florentine or just prior to that, you know.
Smith, when I'm just interrupt you, he felt that the two great moments in the history of art were the moments in which sculpture and painting were completely integrated and inseparable. And one of them was prehistory. And, you know, he gives you a clue to why, and the other was Cubism.
That's right. Thank you, Michael. That's exactly what I meant to say, because he's both. I think often we think David Smith is a sculptor. To me, I see him as a painter also.
He thought of himself that way too.
That's right. That's right. So that's what I meant about the invention of early painting, cave painting, was it prior as a sculpture form. This is something that I've been thinking lately a lot in regard to the strip away of the painted sculpture that he had early on, which is a incredible crisis and almost a form of offense. But we won't go to that. That's another, you know, entities altogether.
Another way of thinking about Smith in the future, I think, is about his emphasis on immanence as opposed to transcendence. I mean, these things are alive. Everything is alive.
Yes.
That's not particularly modernist.
Yes. Well, remember, David, he's famously say that I don't touch, I touch with the eye, remember? So anyway, sculpture is a very rich dialogue. Don't take it for granted. So thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, David. Back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Fong, so much. And thank you all for your questions today. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome Paul Ebenkamp here. Paul Ebenkamp is author of The Louder the Room, the Darker the Screen, Timeless and from Timeless Infinite. Light, but available through Night Boat, and Parallel Realism and Late Hiss. He co-hosts the Woolsey Heights reading series from their home in Berkeley, and the bottom right corner of all things, a PDF of visual art, is forthcoming from Compline Editions. Thanks so much, Paul, for being here. I'll turn it to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you so much, Michael and David, for the conversation. I've always loved David Smith's work, and this is, I'm very grateful to contribute to this. And just to, I'm really feeling the emphasis on David Smith's sort of deep time imagination. And I think one thing I'll take away from this this conversation that I will remember is the image of him at the Voltri Studios, drawing on the floor with his finger into what looks like the kind of native soot dust of the factory. And I often feel in writing like I'm scratching something in the desk, and it reminded me of the first time I saw petroglyphs in the American Southwest. And so these are beautiful resonances, and I'm grateful to be here for it. I'll close this out with I'm going to read a poem, a work in progress of just about 100 unpunctuated couplets. The poem is called Peace. For thinner ruins ran its voice out, fed petal folded to the new past, swollen distance in the first place, lumen naturae, reason in its mouth, summer light like caution tape, licked in sand and few and countless, with eyes and aspens. As shadows cast us, louder than a new moon, everywhere and once, who loved government in its new look, one heartbeat too far for body work, smothered in its secret language, dry to the touch in an eon, honest rumored absolution burning down the door, took viscera and walked. Then I wasn't. Now I'm not. Along the circle it took to get here. A world made for disbelief. Trickle down dualism in another half-wrecked culture crying with greed. Under the sun's infected eye. Innovation weary, aching to be fucked. New flesh in ritual backlash, difficulty swallowing a vacuum to what it thinks clean, religious insides. Kept the aspect ratio stretched taut in the defacing thirst of its froth. Fed back haptic clickbait looking backwards both ways for time. In anger and togetherness, and music that seems only to recede. Hey, Great Spirit, smiling through my lab skin, backlit into atonal gray out, as a voiceover in power fed the air I knew I needed to be wrong or nothing happens. My marrow, my chrome hungered from the depths of a blood clot, as the selective evil of attention trembles off, as pops and skips, people laughing into view. And a peace fell upon the media, asleep at the top of its lungs, sucking its loopholes, thinking there's time in the world where I'd spin back apart if we weren't already walking through the bright side of what none know. Breeze of fixative, anciently pixelated, continuity error, how to live, what to do. If I couldn't, maybe I would. In wrought narrows of, where's this going? Where are you? The sky, a blue wall of silence, high concept minutia, in the shape of what I told the truth, bleed it back. written such that you could hear the world around me, praying through its teeth, lusted wincing in the window's defense, or mirror and knots, same difference. Too much to remember, too much to forget. To not work like that, to not fit in the trap, heat lamp in broad daylight, soul taped to the back of its head, spinning threshold, erasure's guest, in a chaos of worth, light of day, in fear of enough, and form and color, and the more you dig, the less there is, that told no tale and let no witness in, from the festive, tesseract-fed police state teething its niche, painkillers for missing the point. And right and wrong gnarl the wind goes the way it came. Not waving, not drowning. Reject entertainment. No death. No analysis textures it. No palliative endures the perfect. Those slayings are limitless. And pain without distances. It is possible to concentrate and still be useless. Wrong in one's symmetry. Breath presets stuff to oneness in the casual cruelty of personal space. Deepening crisis. Feel the sun on someone's face. Hieratic trailing off and gory lamentations over public figures. Never-ending semicircle. Worn to brightness by the strobe lights of home. From practice back to habit, back to accident, to wild waste, made more sense the more it's decreated into something else's psychoactive crossroads clutter that doesn't end somewhere. Love us down to nerves and carbon, the wrath and solace of moonlight on an open wound. Comfort zone, common problem, heard down its throat. The outside personal, be why I'm here. Until supposedly final touches collapse in delirium, middle begin again. Plain spun, dying for some sing-song. In my body art, bit into the cusp. Follow the blind spot regalia, loyal haters. Follow dusk burst like noise into law. Touch starved and still I hesitated. Today won't be yesterday for long. And between deaths, the permanence of life led me. And when I lived, what was the difference? Foundation crept in. Repeating sideways, we never turn around. Back to the bandage, chest to the skin. Stiffen and wane in the dead of spring. Time doesn't tell. Time does nothing. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Paul, so much. It's a really incredible way to end an amazing conversation today. Thank you, Michael and Levi, so much for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Lauren Russell. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much again for today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you so
you.
much.
Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Levi.
That was
Thank
amazing.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
David.
Have a lovely
Bye.
afternoon.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you,
Yeah,
Paul.
thank
for the
you
beautiful
all.
That was
reading.
incredible. That
Thank
was
you.
so
Great to be a part of
Thank you.
this. Thank you so
Be
much.
great. Thank you so much.